Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 29 for the week ending November 11th, 2016, the Brave New World edition. Yes, it is our first post-election This Week in FCPA edition, so as you might expect, we will talk about Donald Trump's stunning victory and what it means for regulatory enforcement under the S.E.C. and for enforcement of the FCPA from the Department of Justice perspective. We take a look at the new French anti-corruption law, FCPA-Episode. We take a look at the article second in a two-part series by Scott Moritz, our good friend and colleague, on compliance and mergers and acquisitions. In this part two, Scott and we focus on the post-acquisition component. Scott advocates a three-pronged approach, which I think you will find interesting. We talk about the expansion of the Volkswagen emissions testing scandal investigation to include the former CEO, Martin Finkelkorn, and what that might mean for VW going forward. We talk about the stunning announcement from Rio Tinto that it has suspended a senior executive for a payment to a consultant to assist the company in obtaining a mining concession in Guinea that it had previously lost. We talk about the first episode of Everything Compliance, my new podcast where I talk to Jay, Mike Volkoff, Jonathan Armstrong, and Matt Kelly. And Jay talks about it from the interviewee perspective. Jay gives us some of the highlights of the Jay Rosen Weekend Report. We talk about an article recently out by Joe Waring and Julia Rappaport-Schinker entitled Refusing to Settle Why Public Companies Go to Trial in Federal Cases. The podcast is a little bit longer than usual, coming in at about 40 minutes this time. I also have to apologize. GoToMeeting was not working today, so we had to do a phone recording, and the quality of the recording is less than our usual sterling quality. Nevertheless, it was an interesting week in FCPA. I hope you enjoy it. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA for the week ending November 11th, 2016. It is indeed a brave new world. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to This Week in FCPA. My good friend and colleague, Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen. Jay, with a very new welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome to the Brave New World edition of This Week in FCPA.
That is very true, and we are certainly in uncharted territory, but hopefully we can talk about some of that. And we had a few compliance-related things this week, so we have a fair amount to talk about. So for anyone who didn't see the news, and I guess there might be some other Nick Sabans in the world, there was a presidential election this week, and Donald Trump is now the president-elect of the United States. So we're going to probably save a little bit of that one for the end, but I wanted to get that right up front in case there are people who are listening who, like Nick Saban, were not aware that there was a presidential election this week. But there was some substantive anti-corruption news this week. And one of those things, Jay, was a passage of a new French anti-corruption law called FCPA-Episode. So have you had a chance to look at that and have any thoughts on what that may mean going forward?
Yeah, I think it basically draws some key points from the FCPA and also takes a look at or takes some inspiration from the UK Bribery Act. And, I think it's the best of both worlds. There's a DPA option. There is an anti-corruption agency that's set up in France to respond. And it seems like there's a bit of global jurisdiction because they either can form an axis between a French bribe payer, a French bribe payee, or a French company. So it seems to be pretty well encompassing. And I think the only downside that I read is, I'm not sure what the acronym does, maybe AFA, but they don't really have the ability to charge. They have the ability to investigate. And I think the charging decision still has to come from their equivalent of the DOJ. Right. Did I say that correctly?
Close.
close.
Okay.
But the Agence Française Anticorruption, for all you Inspector Clouseau fans out there, you're absolutely right. It does not have the ability, Jay, to bring charges. That still has to be done by French prosecutors. But I was somewhat intrigued, and it will be an interesting experiment to see, because they are charged with helping companies put compliance programs in place, or in short, be more compliant. So they are to assist public and private sector in preventing and detecting corruption, verify that companies have adopted compliance programs, help reporting possible violations to relevant prosecutors, and overseeing corporate monitorship. So, maybe there's a place for a non-prosecutorial wing of the government or arm of the government to help companies actually be more compliant. The S.E.C. certainly, I think, does that, but they, of course, have joint enforcement jurisdiction as well, and the Canadian Corruption or Canadian Authority also helps companies to do that. So I think that will prove interesting. A couple of other things I'd like to highlight, Jay. One is it expands French prosecutorial reach to extraterritorial cases, meaning those outside of France. So if you are subject to this law and you violate it outside of France, no, they will come after you. Also, there's expanded and strengthened the whistleblower protections, and the law provides that if a company does not have a compliance program in place, that can lead to itself could lead to a fine and penalty of up to 1 million euros for legal entities. The compliance program requirement is something that I think many of our listeners, Jay, will be comfortable with. It includes a code of conduct, an internal reporting mechanism, a corruption risk assessment mechanism, third-party due diligence procedures, accounting controls, training programs for employees in high-risk positions, disciplinary procedures, and an effective mechanism for evaluating the effectiveness of your compliance program going forward. So for most U.S. and U.K. companies, Jay, I think they're going to have these in place. My suggestion would be for the compliance practitioners listening to this podcast that they map out those 7 prongs I listed in a spreadsheet, basically, so that if a French regulator comes knocking or the AFA comes knocking, you can present information, documented evidence that you have a compliance program in place which meets the requirements of the French law. Also, I would note, Jay, that the law becomes effective 6 months after the implementation. So companies basically have 6 months to get these programs in place. So it's going to be interesting. I'm really intrigued with this anti-corruption agency. Admittedly, they don't have the hammers that the SFO, the U.S. Department of Justice, or even the S.E.C. has. Nevertheless, they may be there to actually help companies have greater compliance. So next up, we had the...
Hey, Tom?
Yep.
Sorry, I was on mute. I had a quick question for you. In the section where it talks about the financial penalties, and it says for individuals, it shall not exceed 200,000 euros and 1 million euros for entities. That's exclusive of any disgorgements. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Okay. Because it just seems like, one of the things that our practitioners here in the U.S. are always struggling with is the calculus of whether or not to disclose. And there doesn't seem to be any of that wording that we have here about, what kind of credit will be given and what kind of discount you get from either the bottom or the top of the range.
Right.
Yeah. So that's all. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, next up we had a fairly stunning announcement out of Germany involving the VW emission testing scandal, where the German prosecutors are now investigating the former CEO of his last name just escaped me. But the former CEO, I will put it that way. And he
Winterkorn?
yes, That's exactly right. Could you repeat that?
Winterkorn.
Winterkorn, Mr. Martin Winterkorn. And he resigned shortly after the scandal was made public. He, of course, said that it was the work of rogue employees, specifically rogue engineers. So if you're an engineer out there listening to this, go see the new Star Wars movie Rogue One and commune with your fellow rogues. Nevertheless, very odd that you would have a CEO investigated in a criminal capacity, but this scandal shows that it was really, I think it's going to show pretty well known within Volkswagen what was going on and what the fallout for that is in terms of any criminal sanctions, but I think more importantly will be enhanced or additional monetary penalties to the company. So we're going to have to follow that one. Jay, our good friend, Mr. Scott Moritz, wrote a very interesting blog post in the FCPA blog. It was the second of a two-part series that he's put together on M&A work in compliance. And in this part two, he took a look at what you need to do post-acquisition. So did you have a chance to take a look at this and give us your thoughts on what Scott told us?
Yeah, I mean, Scott is always really on the top of things, and this is a great part two of the blog. And there are three key areas that Scott recommends that your company consider when they're contemplating an acquisition. The first one would be identifying the universe of foreign official touch points. So in terms of your sales force, whether it's third party or direct, how are they actually interacting with people? So if you're interacting with a hospital in China, is that considered a state-owned entity, and is there anything that you need to identify further before moving forward? The second point is fully identifying all intermediaries and among third parties. And the key point there is most of the issues that we find that arise on a bribery or an FCPA scale tend to be the relationships between third parties who are either helping move deals along or helping move freight across the border. So that third party is usually a key touch point for you to really do your diligence on. And the third thing would be examining hiring practices as they relate to foreign officials. And that would really, in my mind, tie back to the issues that we've read about over the last year for the Princelings. So those are his three takeaways. And in this case, he really succinctly goes through and, you know, it's just a very thoughtful way to think about M&A. And in the past, I really don't think that people consider the strength of a compliance program, and they don't consider whether or not you're acquiring a company that does not have the same level, and how is that integration going to happen. If you ask the questions that Scott proposes before you do a deal, you have the opportunity to prevent yourself from falling into a bad situation. And then if you do know there's remediation involved, that gives you the ability to retrade the deal, to ask for advice from any regulatory bodies, and to also figure out what those costs of remediation may be ahead of time.
And he really, once again, this is a two-part series, so obviously part one was pre-acquisition. But he emphasizes in this post-acquisition piece as well what you can and should do in the pre-acquisition phase. And really, within the constraints of information available to you, the more you can do, whether it's private source, public source, or other information, it's going to help you and inform these areas that he's highlighted. A couple of other takeaways I got from this post, Jay, was that he advocated a mapping process or a mapping procedure where you actually map the foreign official touch points to your company, and he called it an inventory of all the ways your organization could come into contact with foreign officials. So I thought that was a really interesting way to think about it and a good way to document what you found. If I can maybe use this as a starting point for a larger discussion, Jay, Scott Moritz was one of the first people I met through the FCPA blog. It's really the first blog post that I can remember that really stuck out to me, and it was in December of 2009. Scott wrote about a risk-based compliance program, and that was the first time I was introduced to Scott, but it was really the first time I was introduced to the concept of having a risk-based program. And I contacted Scott after that, and of course his contact information was in the blog post, and he was very open and generous about speaking with me. Has really been a big fan and a good friend of my compliance journey, and has helped me quite a bit. And it really shows to me the power of the compliance community. And I know you've talked about that we really are a community. We really do support each other, and we really do help each other. And we don't call each other names. And if we do criticize each other, we do so professionally. And what my experience with Scott in this blog post really took me back to that we are a community, and we're a community that shares ideas, and we're a community that shares concepts. Everybody has their own business. Everybody has their own client relationships. But, there's not a lot of trade secrets. In fact, there are no trade secrets in compliance. And the secret sauce is up inside your head on how you do it and how you interact with people and clients. And Scott, for me, is one of those people who is very giving, very generous of his time, and very generous to people like myself. And we both saw him at the FCPA Blog New York conference, and he was there and supporting not only Casson, his client relations efforts, but the rest of us as well. So I just wanted to throw a shout out not only to Scott and the FCPA Blog for putting this together, but really that concept of a compliance community, and as Dick Casson envisioned the FCPA Blog, a bulletin board. It was a bulletin board where Scott Moritz and I could stand next to each other virtually and have a conversation about all of this. So it really drove home the point to me that people utilize the FCPA Blog and they utilize it as a bulletin board, as a way to communicate information, both to present information and for people like you and I, we just talked about it, to gather that information and either to incorporate that into our compliance programs or advising to our own clients.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Tom. And just to further the concept of this, virtual bulletin board, Dick Casson has really, created an open source solution. So, there really is no secret sauce into FCPA and anti-corruption. It's a matter of sharing best practices and rolling up your sleeves, doing the work, doing compliance, as you say. And, the only thing that really can sometimes limit people are your financial budgets. But I think, with us having an open source community, there is always somebody to talk to. And to your earlier point, everyone within the community is very gracious about sharing their time and connecting. And as long as, somebody has a question, there are going to be many people out there with potential answers.
So, Jay, we had what I thought was you can't make this kind of stuff up, or the corollary, I can't write a book about a fictional book about the FCPA because fiction has to be believable. Rio Tinto announced that it was suspending a senior executive who had approved the payment to a consultant, third-party consultant, when the company reobtained mining rights in the African country of Guinea. And the unbelievable or weird part of this, as I used Hunter S. Thompson in my blog post on it today, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro, Rio Tinto had mining rights to a mine called Simandou in Guinea. They lost those mining rights to an Israeli company called BSRG. BSRG had a lot of negative publicity for alleged or possible FCPA violations in obtaining those rights. Well, lo and behold, after BSRG got these rights, they had regime change in Guinea through the death of the then president, Condi, and the next president, Conti, came in. And Conti stripped BSRG of their rights for this mining concession. And lo and behold, Rio Tinto got it back. And they got it back through the intercession of a good friend of the new president, Conti, who happened to be the third-party consultant paid by Rio Tinto and paid a $10.5 million fee. Rio Tinto discovered this, self-disclosed to the SFO and the DOJ. They're also disclosing to relevant Australian authorities because Rio Tinto is an Australian domiciled company. So very interesting to see, according to the Wall Street Journal yesterday, I believe Sam Rubenfeld reported that they had reviewed documents and emails which showed that the approval went up to all the way to the top. The then CEO of Rio Tinto, that gentleman has now left the company or retired, but the Alan Davies, the senior executive who was still with the company, was suspended immediately. A lawyer involved somehow in the transaction was not identified, has left the employ of the company. So if I told you this story, you would probably said, you really, I know you say you don't do drugs, but you really should stop using drugs because nobody would believe a story like this. And so it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out.
Very interesting indeed. But, the one thing we can always be assured of in the FCPA world is that, me with being a frustrated screenwriter and you with your, novelistic intentions, you can't make this stuff up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, rogue engineers and, people who are just giving away airplane tickets by the droves, and nobody knows where the money comes from and nobody approves it. So one thing I'd like to do now is if we can take a little turn towards the president-elect. And there's a piece that I think will provide a few minutes of discussion. It was in the New York Times Deal book on November 9th, written by Peter Henning, and it says how Trump's presidency will change the Justice Department and the S.E.C. So I'll let you kick it off. Or actually, this is what I'll put out there for discussion. My take on the article is that there will still be a large FCPA presence. There's some major cases to flush through the system, and a lot of this stuff gets prosecuted by career prosecutors. They don't tend to come and go with political changes. That being said, there seems to be some equal pressure to want to reorganize the S.E.C., and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, Tom, because a lot of times these prosecutions that we see or these resolutions are usually DOJ moving in lockstep with the S.E.C., and the majority of the fines levied this year seem to have come more from the S.E.C. side on the books and records instead of DOJ. So any thoughts on the future of those two departments in D.C.?
Well, you mentioned the New York Times Deal book article. There have been a couple of other articles of note. Matthew Stephenson wrote a just nightmarish piece on his blog, the Global Anticorruption Blog, about where global anti-corruption, or at least U.S. anti-corruption prosecutions are going. So we'll link to that as well because it really is the true nightmare scenario. Matt Kelly wrote about 5 things CCOs should think about going forward, and Matt and I did a podcast on that in our podcast of Compliance Into the Weeds, where we go into that and Matt's angle a little bit. So I may bring a couple of those in this discussion going forward, but people I think, need to separate out the DOJ and S.E.C., first of all, because a large portion of S.E.C. prosecutions come from Dodd-Frank. The whistleblower information comes from Dodd-Frank. In-house, I think, will gut Dodd-Frank to the extent they may repeal Dodd-Frank. They have made clear that they don't want the U.S. consumer to have any protections going forward, and they're going to make sure that happens. The Dodd-Frank whistleblower provision, if that gets thrown out, that will end a major source of information to the Securities and Exchange Commission about a wide range of securities violations. They may wish to gut that as well. On the Department of Justice side, though, and the Times article really pointed this out, which is you're absolutely correct that it is career prosecutors working on FCPA cases, but they are largely self-funded. And by that, I mean they come to the department now via internal investigations, which lead to self-disclosures. The Department of Justice has made it extremely attractive for companies to self-disclose in the form of a pilot program. Of course, that builds upon the Yates memo, but the pilot program provides, we've had, I think, 5 cases where declinations have been issued since the pilot program came out. They were in the works before the pilot program started. Nevertheless, I don't think it's possible to discount the effect of the pilot program. All that's a very long-winded way of saying the Department of Justice has this incredibly cost-effective, efficient, self-reporting, self-funding mechanism to prosecute FCPA cases. I don't think that the Republican, let me rephrase that. It's not in the interest of the Republican administration to overturn a 38-year-old law that is used to fight corruption and is used as a big part of the war against terrorism. It doesn't matter how many walls Donald Trump builds or even wants to build. International commerce is impervious to walls. Stop air, you can't put up a wall to stop the internet. You can't put up a wall to stop hacking, and you can't put up a wall to stop funding of corruption due to wire transfer of money, whether it's in the U.S. banking system or some other mechanism. So there is always going to be U.S. jurisdiction, even if he has his beloved wall, which keeps the hordes of Mexican rapists out of the United States. The FCPA is a key component. The law is people don't want companies to engage in corruption, even as much as Donald Trump wants to engage in corruption. It really doesn't matter. That's not a value, an American value, and certainly not an American business value. So I don't think they're going to overturn the FCPA. And with this self-funding mechanism, by the point you raised, Jay, that is career prosecutors, not political appointees, who really are involved in this, I think FCPA compliance will continue going forward through a Trump administration. What the administration can change, though, is 2 things. One is the Attorney General can set his priorities for criminal prosecution and investigation, and that, of course, will go down to the organization. And certainly Congress and the Attorney General can set budget and funding priorities. So this past year, the FCPA unit of the Department of Justice expanded from 10 to 20. If there's some members of Congress or the Attorney General who wants to stop that or gut that, they can cut funding. If you have this influx of cases, what that will do is negatively impact American business because it will slow down prosecutions because the number of people looking at the cases will slow down, and I don't think that's something the American business community wants. Also, if they move away from an FCPA priority, that means all of those companies out there that are not U.S., the Totals of the world, the Alstoms of the world, the Siemens of the world, the E&Is of the world, any of those companies that have gone through an FCPA enforcement action that are not U.S. companies, the U.S. would be really at a disadvantage business-wise because those companies would be engaging in corruption, and that's not something that the United States wants to foster going forward. So for a lot of reasons, I think the FCPA will continue. What I do think, though, Jay, and really not pointed out in this article, is I do think that the Chamber of Commerce will use this opportunity to amend the FCPA to put a compliance defense in place. They may try to amend the definition of an instrumentality, but state-owned enterprises are such a key player and actor in international terrorism and in cyber attacks that if they change the definition of instrumentality to cut out state-owned enterprises, it really diminishes the impact of the FCPA as a tool in the fight against terrorism. So they're going to have to think very closely about that. But it would not surprise me to see some sort of amendments put onto the FCPA. And if they put a compliance defense on it, I think people like you and me would now be helping companies to put compliance programs in place. So I don't see really a negative impact on the FCPA, in spite of the fact Donald Trump has said this is a horrible law. It's actually a very good law for the United States as a whole. So it's going to be interesting to see. And, Jay, what I would like to suggest before, and I expect you to have some rebuttal thoughts to my comments, this is going to be an appropriate topic for episode 2 of our new podcast, Together Everything Compliance. I think we're going to have to dedicate an entire podcast to our rampant speculation on where compliance may be going forward.
So I've got a quip and a question. So my quip is that if I understand the thinking of the president-elect, it's okay to go after the corruption in Washington, D.C., of which Secretary Clinton was the head of, but it's not going to be okay to go after any corruptions within the banking system. And if the president-elect had it his way, there would not have been a problem with what went down at Wells Fargo. So there seems to be a pretty big disconnect there for me, and maybe it's just because I'm a simple guy and I'm from New Hampshire, but, I need this stuff explained to me like I'm a 3-year-old, and my feeling is corruption, whether it happens globally, whether it happens locally. And if this election is a call for change and a call for Washington not doing things the way they did before, I think it would be ill-advised for the president-elect to change either of those laws.
Well, I think you are moving towards a more general point that there is not a lot of internal coherence in the pronouncements of President-elect Trump, but that demeans the word internal coherence in and of itself. So I think we're in uncharted territory, or as I read today in one of the great quotes I've ever read, you sound like a mayor of Pompeii. How's that volcano doing? So we are in uncharted territory, though. And you raised some really great points that within the Trump electorate and the Trump coalition, if I can use those words together, there are disparate parts and forces, one of which is an anti-Washington force, but that is in direct conflict with what I would certainly call traditional Republican business principles. A populist view of financial regulation and financial protection is that the populists need to be protected from the big companies, not big companies need to be protected from the populists. So I see a dichotomy between what general Republican philosophy is in President Trump in some areas, but there's a straight Republican Congress and they can do what they want. He may or may not accede to that. He's not beholden to anyone. He got elected on his own with his base. So who knows?
So one last thing to throw out there before we wrap up. Did you see that picture of that little kitty I sent you from Jack Kelly's blog on LinkedIn today? And
I did.
Do you think it could be as draconian as he lays it out, that if you're a compliance officer at an investment bank or a financial institution, that you better fire up that resume and start learning a new skill set?
Well, I do think that President-elect Trump, I should say, he's not president yet, and the incoming Republican Congress have made clear they're going to gut Dodd-Frank. But compliance at financial institutions did not start at Dodd-Frank. It started with Sarbanes-Oxley. And I don't think they're going to gut SOX, because SOX was a specific response to some horrific frauds and crimes perpetrated on the U.S. public by corporate America, including, Enron here in Houston. And what that negatively impacted was everyone's 401. And one of the reasons I think you had such a strong congressional response to Enron, to WorldCom, to Dept, was that by those accounting frauds, it gutted people's self-funded retirement programs, and that's not something that it's in the business community's interest to repeal or pull back from. So I think Dodd-Frank will be gutted to the extent that people's jobs depend on Dodd-Frank. there is that distinct possibility. But banks, financial institutions, and even non-financial institution business organizations still have the money laundering issue, and banks still have that problem. And banks cannot cut back on that because that is directly in line with the fight against terrorism. Money laundering, I mean, we just saw a story today on a Wells Fargo employee who was arrested for allegedly helping people launder money. And that is not in this country's interest to cut back on money laundering laws, which foster criminal activity, which foster corruption and terrorism, or which foster much of anything else. So part of me says Dodd-Frank will be gutted, but and perhaps from Jack's perspective, particularly in New York where he works, that is a concern. But a lot of compliance is based on Sarbanes-Oxley. Money laundering is not going to go away. It's part of the Patriot Act. That's certainly not going to be gutted by this Republican Congress. So that's sort of where I stand on that.
Great. And just two more resources that we'll point out in the show notes. There's a pretty good client brief from Miller Chevalier talking about France's new anti-corruption law. And there's an interesting piece of white paper that just came out from Joe Warren and Julie Rappaport Schenker at Gibson Dunn. And the article is entitled Refusing to Settle, Why Companies Go to Trial in Federal Criminal Cases. And it kind of looks at the recent Tyson case and the FedEx case and why, for certain criminal things, companies are willing to go to bat and get a trial, whereas for certain other things in terms of our world with FCPA and DPA and NPA. So it's a good meaty piece of scholarship, and if anybody's interested, we'll link that in the show notes as well.
And now, but before we close, Jay, and you tell us with our traditional ending wrap-up of the Jay Rosen Weekend Report, I wanted to mention our new podcast, Everything Compliance, because I wanted to ask you, and for those who don't know, I started a new podcast where I have a roundtable format. Jay participates, also Mike Volkoff, Matt Kelly, and Jonathan Armstrong. We did a live podcast at S.E.C 2016 Compliance and Ethics Institute. We had so much fun, and I had such great response that we decided to make it a regular show. But what I wanted to ask you, Jay, was what's it like sitting on the other side of the mic as a participant, and how does the format work for you, even if it's a virtual recording?
Well, I think it's another extension of Dick Casson's bulletin board that I think we're quite lucky to, be able to get together a group of us, from different perspectives, even from the other side of the pond. So this is a great opportunity just to learn what other practitioners are thinking. It's a great free exchange for ideas, and maybe we can even rotate on like a guest commentator from show to show. If we have something that's a special subject or something that is happening in one part of the world. But I think it's a great addition to the conversation out there, and I'm happy that you've put it together and graciously invited me to join.
Well, thank you. So, what do we have to look forward to in the Jay Rosen Weekend? I'm still up in the air. I'm deciding if I want to get on my soapbox, or, if the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. But there will be some type of commentary about the future of compliance as we see it being a work in progress. All right. Well, we will greatly look forward to that. So, what did you call this edition?
The Brave New World edition.
Brave New World edition. So this is a wrap on the Brave New World edition for November 11th. Please remember to thank a veteran today if you haven't done so. It's because of people who serve this country that we got to vote last Tuesday. So a shout out to every veteran out there in every war that defended our country. And Jay, I look forward to continuing the conversation next week.
Great. Thanks, Tom, and thanks everybody for listening in on the FCPA week that was. Take care.
All right.